Welcome back. In a few hours from now, at exactly 12:30 a.m. Indian Standard Time, President Donald Trump will announce whether the United States will stay or leave the Paris Climate Pact. US reports in the media say that he is likely to pull out, though there may be some caveats in the language. So we'll have to wait and see what the fine print is. Now, what is the Paris Accord? Well, it's a landmark deal that was reached in 2015 between 195 countries that seeks to avoid some of the worst effects of climate change by curbing global greenhouse gas emissions. An American withdrawal would seriously weaken global efforts to avoid drastic climate change. And under the Paris Agreement, basically every country, including India, submitted an individual plan to tackle its greenhouse gas emissions. However, it's a non-binding deal. India has pledged to cut its emissions by 30 to 35% by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. India, like other developing nations, are also meant to get funds from developed countries in order to switch to cleaner technologies. But if the US pulls out of this deal, there are question marks over that funding as well. Well, Namrata Brar joins us from New York with the very latest on that. Namrata, what is the US media saying now? There is some talk about perhaps there being some kind of conditions or caveats in the language as they're putting it in President Trump's announcement. What are you hearing?
I think the jury is still out. There are lots of back and forth between what has been defined as the anti-Paris climate camp led by Steve Bannon, as well as the pro-Paris Climate Act led by Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, and Ivanka Trump, Donald Trump's daughter himself. So a lot of back and forth going, and what we would see possibly is some middle ground and not an outright dismissal of the Paris Climate Act agreement. Nidhi, I just want to highlight two things. One, giving up would not just mean just favoring the America First movement and helping the coal mine industry jobs locally, which has been a campaign promise in Donald Trump's entire run-up. But it would also mean giving up America's leadership on geostrategic matters. This is a huge vacuum, and China will definitely step in. The second important part is what happens if US comes out of the deal and countries like China, European Union and India still stick to commitments. The answer is a very diluted version, because US, as being the second largest polluter in the world, emits 5.1 million kilotons of carbon dioxide every year. India, in comparison, emits only 2 million kilotons. So for US to come out of it, there is no way that the targets of 2 degrees Celsius of global warming can possibly be met.
All right, Namrata, big story, actually, a big international story. We'll be coming back to you when it happens at around 12:30 this morning. Thanks very much. I spoke earlier in the day to Mr. Shyam Saran, India's former foreign secretary, also was the Prime Minister's special envoy on climate change. I began by asking him what the impact would be of any US decision to pull out of the Paris Accord.
Well, given the fact that the US is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, if the United States decides to pull out, that means that the burden of making the adjustment in terms of reducing greenhouse gases will fall on other parties to the Paris Agreement, including India.
Well, what, sir, would the specific practical fallout be? I mean, you know, this is a big commitment that India made in Paris in 2015. Getting so many countries on board was itself, you know, quite an achievement. Specifically, what would the practical fallout be? Well,
I think, as I mentioned, that they will have to meet together and take stock. What is the impact going to be in terms of what should be the additional action which has to be taken by other parties to the agreement. And naturally, as far as I'm concerned, most of that additional burden should be borne by those who are capable of bearing that burden, which is essentially the developed countries, both in Europe as well as in North America and countries like Japan and Australia.
You know, if the United States was to withdraw from this accord in a few hours from now, Mr. Saran, do you think that politically, diplomatically, India could also perhaps look at a greater leadership role here on the issue of climate change, in a sense that already happened in the run-up to the Paris Climate Summit, where Mr. Modi is said, you know, to have played a big role? Do you think India could do much more on the world stage and take a more leadership role, a bigger leadership role?
Well, the Prime Minister has, I think, very wisely declared that even if the United States pulls out of the Paris Agreement, India as a party to the agreement intends to fulfill its commitments. And I think that's a very important statement from him. As you remember that going up to the Copenhagen meeting, it is the basic countries, essentially Brazil, you had India, you had China, you had South Africa, who actually together played a very important role in those negotiations. Now, for whatever reason, during the last few years of Obama administration, China and the US found it more in their interest to work out deals bilaterally and then bring those deals to the multilateral forum, which is what happened in Paris. If you remember, they first agreed upon a bilateral deal, which then became the template for the Paris Agreement later on. And we did not really have much of a role to play except in terms of generally acquiescing in that particular template. I think we have today an opportunity where perhaps it will be in China's own interest and in the interest of other emerging countries like India to perhaps come together again and see what are the ways in which we can shape together a new climate change regime. Because the Paris Agreement is a framework agreement. We are currently engaged in actually fleshing it out. So this is a good opportunity for India, not by itself, but also along with other emerging countries, to actually regain an important and I think a sort of a leadership role in terms of taking the Paris Agreement forward. So yes, the possible pullout of the United States from the agreement is going to be a negative development, but I do not think that it necessarily means that the Paris Agreement itself is in any danger, because most of the other parties have already declared that they will continue to adhere to it, as India has. And I think as long as there is a willingness to take on some of the additional burden, which should be, as I mentioned, mainly by the developed countries, I think we can go ahead with this particular agreement, implementation of this agreement.
Well, that was Mr. Shyam Saran, who was, of course, the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on Climate Change, someone who really understands this subject better than any of us here. Sadanand still with us, Ambassador K.C. Singh and Sunita Narayan also joining us on this big, important story. Sunita Narayan, your first thoughts on now the very real likelihood that the US is going to pull out. You heard, Shyam Saran there talking about what India can do and what possibly India may even stand to gain from this. But just the fact that the US, as such a large emitter, as such a key, signatory to this agreement, if it pulls out, is there a real danger that the entire fight against climate change will slowly unravel?
Yeah, Nidhi, I'm a little surprised at what Mr. Saran has said. Because frankly, please understand the role of the United States. There are two essential issues. One, it is a massive contributor even today to climate change. 15% of the annual emissions come from one country, the US. So you cannot talk about shifting the burden to other countries. The other problem is that the US, under Donald Trump, has said not only will it not be part of the Paris Agreement, but it will increase its fossil fuel use, it will mine more coal, it will have more manufacturing, which means it's basically saying it will increase its emissions. Now, in that scenario, I don't think anybody can argue that climate change can be combated. I think we are in big trouble. And the second thing is that we have always argued that the Paris Agreement in itself was extremely unambitious and inequitable. And it was made so because to get the US on board. And I think what the world community has to recognize is that we bend backwards, we come down to the lowest common denominator, we erase every issue of equity only to bring the world's biggest polluter on board, and then they walk out. Yeah. That's what we need to learn. Yeah. And we need to make sure that we can do things differently next time.
Well, you're clearly very concerned. Ambassador K.C. Singh, would you share that concern that Sunita has? And diplomatically also, this is a huge story. This will have repercussions on the US's relationship with other countries as well. Do you think that China and India will be able to stand their ground if the US actually withdraws? Even though publicly right now we're saying, we will.
Look, there are a couple of clarifications which are needed. One is, are they only withdrawing from the Paris climate agreement? If that is so, they need a 3-year notice period.
That's right.
Which means it's not happening tomorrow morning. They'll have to give a notice, and then in due course, it goes up really to the end of his first term. So Mr. Trump may be re-elected, may not be re-elected. It leaves the door open of US always coming back. Because don't forget, Kyoto Protocol, which was the predecessor to this, was given up by George Bush in 2002. So this is not the first time that a Republican president who are generally science deficient in approaching climate change and are ideology led have generally been skeptical that there's really no danger of climate change. But I think Trump is taking it to an utter extreme, whereas Ms. Sunita Narayan explained, is not only a question of saying we will not abide by it, but you're going the other way with fossil fuels, with Keystone Pipeline, with generally totally opposed to whatever you had undertaken. But let me just add one or two things. One is that basically the Kyoto Protocol was that it's the developed countries which will take on the obligations. The developing countries said, you created the problem, you solve it. But what happened in Paris is that India and China on a voluntary basis said, okay, we will take on the obligations, but the developed world also came on board because they have to give you technology, they have to bring money on.
Exactly.
From 2020 onwards, you need $100 billion a year. Now, if US is stepping out, can that be done by Europe alone? I don't know, because it was a bargain where you give me technology cheap. Although some things are happening, let me finish with that one point, that the declining cost of solar energy is in any case moving even the developing world in the direction of renewables. China is moving very rapidly. India is lagging. So in any case, technology, it's a technology-driven thing. But then you can't have US going in the reverse direction when even the developing world is on board.
Which is why I'm asking Sadanand that when the US backs out, if it does, doesn't it become harder, despite what the Prime Minister publicly said yesterday, pretty much hinting that India would stick by this accord, despite the Chinese leadership today saying that it was still committed to it? Doesn't it become more difficult for India and China to stay on those targets and to fulfill those commitments?
A couple of quick points. I mean, first of all, I agree with what both Sunita Narayan and Ambassador Singh had to say. Obviously, it becomes much harder. This is the second largest emitter in the world. This is a major rich country that was supposed to contribute to making this transition easier for places like India. If the US simply withdraws, it has huge implications, not just in terms of emission, but in terms of India's own progress towards clean energy. I think there's no question about that. But beyond that, I think that this is, what we're looking at is something, we're looking at a sort of unraveling of the world order. Now, it's one thing for the US to do this in isolation, and I agree with the others that this is not a smart move. But you look at this along with other things, withdrawal from TPP, for instance. This is going to create a huge rift between the United States and Western Europe, where climate change is an extremely important issue.
Yeah.
Voters care about it passionately. And the idea that, with all due respect to Ambassador Saran, the idea that, the publics of Western European countries which have their own economic problems are simply going to step up and say, hey, no problem, we're going to sort of shoulder this extra burden, I don't think that squares with what we've been seeing politically in Europe.
That's exactly what I was asking Ambassador Singh as well earlier about the diplomatic fallout of this. But Sunita Narayan, there's another fear that this is going to go beyond the Paris Accord, as you and Ambassador Singh pointed out, that Trump may do something even more radical by pulling out of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is a convention that is more overarching and under which all these sort of protocols come. What would be the implication of that? Because now that's not ruled out. Everything is on the table under Donald Trump.
No, undoubtedly, Nidhi, but I think, the US has been the big country because of which the world has not seen progress on climate change. Let's be clear about this. They were the most reluctant when it came to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. I was in Rio in 1992. US was one country because of which the world did not even at that stage take on targets for the rich world to reduce their emissions. Then came Kyoto, and everything was done to bring the US on board. It was Al Gore at that stage who was in government, and then came George Bush and they walked out of it. They brought the world to their knees and they walked out of it. Now, Barack Obama brought us to our knees in Paris. He changed the entire framework of the climate agreement. He erased the concept of common but differentiated responsibility. We all agreed only to say that, fine, we understand climate change is important. We also will do our bit, but you have to do more. You are the world's historically the biggest emitter. 30% of the stock of greenhouse gases in the air are because of you. You cannot say your lifestyle is not negotiable. That was the deal in Paris. Now even that is on the table. And I think this is time that we need to understand the fact that countries like India are suffering. We need, if at all there is any matter that should be going to the International Court of Justice, it is the issue of climate change. Because the poor in the world who have not made the problem, not contributed to the problem, are today suffering because of extreme weather events, because of today events that are attributed to climate change.
What do you do
this
with the
is
president?
not something we can take so lightly.
Yeah, and unfortunately, what do you do with the president who I think basically believes that climate change is a conspiracy, and in that sense it shouldn't even surprise us, Ambassador, saying that it's come to this. And therefore, let me get to this issue of funding. A key to India's obligations in the Paris Agreement was the fact, as you pointed out, that we would get money for clean technologies. Now, if that money doesn't come, how long can India hold out? And also on this question that Ambassador Shamsaran raised about a leadership role that India could possibly play. Do you think that's possible, or is that a fantasy, as Sunita Narayan seems to think?
No, I'm not saying that, Nidhi. I'm not saying we can't play a leadership.
Very good.
Okay.
Now you,
Sorry, Ambassador, say, go ahead.
You can. Yeah, the leadership role can't be that we take on additional obligations. That can't be the leadership role.
Exactly.
Because I think Prime Minister Manmohan Singh used to make an interesting argument that poverty is the biggest, poverty alleviation and poverty is the biggest polluter. And if we have to wrestle with poverty, then we can't overnight just go to clean energy. And it has to be a transition, a gradual transition. We also know at one stage we used to justify move to nuclear power as one of the ways of weaning India of carbon use of carbon fossil fuels for generating energy. But even that has slowed down. Now we are saying that we'll only make our own reactors and not really then getting the kind of reactors. So the whole world is really re-looking at energy. But I think certainly we have to look to a new partnership with Europe, and this partnership has to work. China seems to be on board, and the Chinese are moving very rapidly in this direction. But then we have also to convey to the Americans, if they've got one of the best possible electric cars in the world, which they want to start exporting to India. Now you can't have it both ways. You can't say America first, but I'll only send out finished products. The world, I think, also has to circle their wagons and tell the American president where he gets off.
Sadanand, the last word to you. What do you think India should do? I mean, if this actually happens, or just wait and watch how this plays out?
I think that, the point that Ambassador Singh raised earlier is very crucial. That first of all, we don't know for certain. We have some reporting that indicates that Trump may pull out. We do not know for certain if he will pull out.
Imagine if this is the complete opposite at 12:30 in the morning.
He's a very impulsive character.
Correct.
We are all expecting him to pull out.
Yeah.
But this is a strange person who surprised us before, so maybe he'll surprise us in a good way this
time.
Then
I'll call you back tomorrow to discuss why he didn't.
Point number one. Number two, there is a time lag.
Yeah.
3 years is a long time. A lot can change in 3 years. We don't know if he'll be around in 3 years. So I would say that this is something to be concerned about at this point, but it is not yet something to be panicking about.
All right. Well, let's see what that announcement does finally entail. And as Sadanand is right, you never know what Donald Trump may actually announce at the end of the day. We may have a completely different subject to talk about tomorrow. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us. It's important, I think, to talk about these issues that normally don't get primetime space on Indian television.